Bacik, 8 minutes.
And I welcome the opportunity to speak on the vitally important issue of vacant homes and the vacant home tax. And indeed for Labour, I'm glad to support this motion from the Social Democrats and commend Deputy O'Callaghan and his colleagues for putting this forward. And as I said last night in the debate we had on the Sinn Féin motion, this motion today, like last night's motion, is just the latest in a series of constructive policy proposals being put forward by opposition parties, providing suggestions, proposals, worked solutions and ways of resolving the housing disaster. And it's disappointing, albeit not surprising, to see government again not engaging with opposition parties on these constructive proposals, to see government again opposing and putting forward counter motions as they did last night and as they're doing today. Because the housing catastrophe, Minister, is of such a scale that it requires a cross-party response. It requires a collaborative and constructive coming together of parties to look at how we can address this catastrophe with the necessary ambition and the necessary urgency. We in Labour have put forward proposals too. On the 9th of February, we put forward a series of 8 emergency measures that we called on government then to adopt prior to the lifting of the temporary no-fault eviction ban. Government again didn't engage and countered and opposed that motion. We've put forward a number of private members' bills suggesting again constructive ways to address the housing catastrophe. A homeless families bill, a bill to implement the Kenny report, a bill on renters' rights. We've put forward most recently to the Taoiseach and Taoiseach and the Housing Minister a bill to provide an evidence basis for the continuance in place of a ban on no-fault evictions until we see a demonstrable drop in homelessness figures. But government has not engaged with these proposals. Instead, we've seen countless government ministers and spokespeople setting out reasons as to why they can't implement opposition measures, instead of telling us how they propose to implement constructive measures to address a housing crisis that you, Minister, and other ministers acknowledge is the biggest crisis facing this country. At our recent Labour conference, I set out an ambitious programme to deliver 1 million homes over 10 years, based on the government's own projections: 50,000 new builds per year, 50,000 refurbishment and deep retrofits per year. These are the government's own figures, your own projections of housing need. The Taoiseach has told us there's a current shortfall of 250,000 homes. The Housing Commission has told us that we need to see up to 62,000 new builds per year to meet demographic demand and existing need. And yet again, government won't engage, and we simply are not seeing a level of ambition and of urgency that is required. Instead, we see a fatalism, a lack of ambition, a lack of creativity in a government response, a government programme that is being put forward at a time when we're seeing record budget surpluses. And like other colleagues, I heard you this morning, Minister, speaking about the record budget surplus, the Stability Programme update, which tells us that there will be a €10 billion surplus in this year's budget. We know we had over €5 billion surplus last year, and yet we're seeing a failure of spending, an underspend of €1 billion on social and affordable home delivery by the Department of Housing, an extraordinary underspend in the teeth of a housing crisis. So we know it is ideology, it's not the economy, it's not resources that are holding back the necessary state investment in housing. It's a reluctance, it seems, Minister, by your government to interfere in the market. And we see on that unexpected and premature decision to lift the ban on evictions without having any contingency plans in place, we see again a government fatalism, a stepping back, an acceptance that this is going to cause immense hardship to the 9,000 individuals served with eviction notices in the second half of last year. Eviction notices at the threshold tell us today, many of which were in fact invalid. And yet we see again a fatalism, a failure by government to adopt the necessary measures that would have provided a safety net for renters facing the loss of their homes at a critical time as we enter the period when children are sitting state exams and when we're hearing from so many families absolutely desperate with nowhere to go. And we see the same fatalism on vacant homes. And yes, we in Labour welcome the vacant homes tax. We welcome any measure that is being introduced by government to address the housing crisis and to increase housing supply. But it's not enough, because we know, even from your own proposals, Minister, that a vacancy tax is simply not enough in itself, and it needs to be set at a higher level to ensure that we see not just revenue raising, but also crucially change in behaviour and change in culture. You've put forward, may I say in your own speech, the lowest estimate of vacant properties in the state. And we know that the CSO have estimated a much higher figure, and the CSO figure of 166,000 set at nearly 8% vacancy rate, a really high vacancy rate comparable to other European countries. That excludes holiday homes, and certainly while the CSO figures in your own vacant homes plan are put forward alongside the other two sets of figures. I note you've only given us the revenue figures, which are the lowest projections, and of course based on self-reporting, that figure of 57,000. And as others have said, the geo-directory figures put the figure at nearly 85,000. It's extraordinary that we simply don't have reliable data on this. But let's take the CSO rates, or let's even take the geo-directory rates. Let's look at the Hardware Association, which is giving us other criteria and suggesting to us that up to 40,000 homes are immediately available for refurbishment, immediately available, that are clearly long-term vacant. And that's the sort of immediacy and the sort of urgency that we need to see addressed to refurbish vacant homes. All of us know in our own constituencies, I see it in Dublin Bay South, we see it everywhere, that there is indeed a high level of vacancy, that there is a high level of dereliction. And the Hardware Association tell us, I think they're right, there's a deep cultural issue here, an acceptance of a high level of spoliation in our built environment. We have to see that tackled, Minister. And government proposals are simply not sufficient and not adequate and are not effective enough to tackle that culture. Your own Vacant Homes Action Plan, I think, has acknowledged that in setting out a series of measures that need to be taken. But we need to see greater urgency on these. And we need to see greater urgency in tackling this high level of vacancy. And we need to see an ambition from government. It can be done. We can see the housing crisis addressed. It's not enough. It's simply not good enough for government to say that you can't address, for example, labour shortages, that you can't address construction inflation. There are ways and means to do this. The ESRI in December set out to you a range of measures to address, that can be activated now by government to address labour shortages. An expansion of the list of skills that are placed in the Critical Skills Visa Programme, for example, to enable an aggressive recruitment campaign of workers from abroad. And I heard Social Justice Ireland backing that call this morning. We need to see that done. Your own estimates say we need another 20,000 construction workers. Let's see government acting on this instead of sitting back and just observing a shortfall of 250,000 homes, observing that there are maybe up to 166,000 vacant properties in the state, observing that we need 20,000 more construction workers. Let's see action being taken urgently, with ambition and with creativity, in the same way we saw the state intervene and revenue commissioners and other state agents intervene in the COVID pandemic, to use the levers of state power, Minister, to use the levers of state power to address what was then such a huge and existential crisis. Let's see those levers being adopted now by the state and by your government. And let's see the measures, like the measures being proposed in today's private member's motion, let's see those measures being adopted by government with urgency.
Moving on to people before profit.